Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Corey Rott, and I will be presenting this webinar today. Several colleagues are also here and may assist at the end with questions. Thank you for joining us today to learn more about the proposed regulations on livestock identification and traceability. This webinar will be specific to sheep producers and owners. There are other scheduled webinars specific to other sectors at the end of April. Please go to our consultation page to learn more about those and sign up if interested. The purpose of this webinar is to present a plain language summary of the proposed regulatory amendment, which is currently up for consultation in Canada Gazette 1. The regulations are legal documents and hence written in regulatory text, legal text, and can be difficult to understand, which is why the CFIA has produced plain language guidance documents available for review or download on our consultation page. Those guidance documents, as well as this webinar, are to help stakeholders understand the changes and requirements proposed. I would note that this webinar is not a substitution for the regulatory text. I will do my best to describe the changes, but in case I make a mistake in my speech and I don't catch it, we also encourage you to visit the Canada Gazette site and read the proposed regulations before submitting comments. Before we get started, some housekeeping rules. Because of the volume of people on the call, we have muted your mics and turned your video off to make sure there's optimal connectivity and to ensure there are no disruptions. During the presentation, feel free to pose your questions via the Q&A function. You can find the Q&A button at the top of the window. Please don't confuse this with the chat function, which will be disabled. It is the Q&A function where you will enter your questions, and my colleagues will attempt to answer them as they are posed. At the very end of the presentation, we will go over some of the questions and answers. So the purpose of this presentation is to provide an overview of the current versus the proposed regulations on livestock identification and traceability under the Health of Animals regulations. The objectives of the livestock traceability system are to reduce the impact of animal disease outbreaks, to provide accurate and up-to-date livestock identity and movement information, and to better protect public health and animal health. Through these proposed regulations, we are attempting to accomplish these objectives. Now, the regulatory proposal addresses four main gaps in the current regulations. The first gap being that livestock species sharing diseases are not all regulated. The regulatory proposal includes goats and cervids as regulated species. The second gap is that the time to report information is too long. The regulatory proposal reduces the reporting window to 7 days for all species. The third gap is that the geographical location of livestock premises is limited. The regulatory proposal introduces the requirement for the identification of livestock premises through provincial PID programs. And the fourth and final gap is that domestic movement information of livestock is limited. The regulatory proposal requires movement reporting at destination sites, with some exceptions, and also requires movement documents to accompany animals in transit. So under the current regulations, the livestock identification traceability regulations only regulate bison, cattle, sheep, and pigs. Under the proposed regulations, goats and cervids will be added, as mentioned in the previous slide. So let's get into the details. And just a reminder, your mics are muted and your cameras are off. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A function located at the top of your screen. So under the current regulations, the locations of sites are required to be recorded and/or reported when new approved indicators are applied to sheep. In addition, premise identification numbers are not required to be recorded or reported under the current federal regulations. In the proposed regulations, you would be required to obtain a premise identification number for your site from your provincial or territorial government. It would also be required to report this number when you purchase approved indicators and report information related to the identification of your sheep or their movements. It would also be required to keep your PID information up to date. For some of you, you may already have a PID, as PID programs exist in every province. It is mandatory in some provinces and voluntary in others, so it depends where you are. Now, in regards to the identification of sheep, under the current regulations, it is prohibited to receive sheep at your site that are not identified with an approved tag. This provision would be repealed in the proposed regulations, as operators of destination sites cannot verify whether or not an animal had an approved indicator when they were loaded on the conveyance. Under the current regulations, you are, however, required to identify sheep with an approved tag before they are removed from their farm of origin. In the proposed regulations, it would be required to identify sheep with an approved indicator before they are removed from a site. So there are two new things to note here. The first being that the term approved tag is being replaced with approved indicator, and this changes to reflect that indicators other than tags are approved, and this allows for advancements in animal identification to be approved easily in the future. Now, this change applies all throughout the regulations. The second new thing is the switch from farm of origin to site. So it would be prohibited to remove sheep from a site unless it bears an approved indicator. In the event that a farm of origin would be spread over different sites, the animals would be required to be identified before they are moved between those sites. And despite this, there will be exemptions that allows animals to be moved off a site without an approved indicator, which include animals being seized based on welfare issues, having to be urgently evacuated for natural disasters, for example, or having a morphology that does not allow for the application of any of the indicators approved for its species. Now, for the identification of sheep carcasses, under the current regulations, as a general rule, carcass refers to the full body of a dead animal. Under the proposed regulations, carcass would refer to any part of the carcass of an animal that exceeds 50% of its weight. And as a general rule, it would refer to dead stock. Currently, you are required to identify the carcass of sheep with an approved tag before they are removed from a site. This provision would be maintained in the proposed regulations. Currently, you are also required to ensure the approved tag is not removed from the carcass until the animal is disposed of on your site. Under the proposed regulations, it would be required to maintain the ability to identify the carcass at the site until it is disposed of, which opens up the possibilities of how you do so. Again, there would be special exemptions that would allow carcasses to be moved off a site without an approved indicator, which include carcasses being abandoned in a place without permission, or having a morphology that does not allow for the application of any of the indicators approved for its species. Indicators approved for sheep and their carcasses can be found through our consultation page, where you will find links to the IBR pages, the incorporated by reference pages, that list the indicators that are approved and revoked for sheep. Currently, approved technology includes FDX and non-electronic forms. Also, the approved manner to identify sheep includes ear tags with markings and identification numbers unique to the animal facing forward. Now, the scope of approval states that indicators listed in the table of approved indicators are approved for all types of domestic movement of sheep and their carcasses within Canada and for export. So here is where the list of approved or revoked indicators for sheep exists. This can be found through our consultation webpage. In the red box, you can see where the links to these pages exist. And here's an example of the sortable table, which can be sorted based on species, technology, color, manufacturer, or program administrator. So regarding movement of sheep now. Under the current regulations, as the operator of the departure site, you are required to record the departure of sheep that are 18 months or older from your site unless they are sent directly to an abattoir. This includes the identification number on the approved tag, the date of departure, the reason for departure, and the name and address of the owner or person having care of the sheep at the destination site. Under the proposed regulations, this record-keeping requirement would be repealed. Further, to be clear, there would be no requirement to report the departure of sheep or sheep carcasses from your site. Now, when transporting sheep or their carcasses from one site to another, currently there are no federal requirements for sheep or their carcasses to be accompanied with any information during transport. Under the proposed regulations, the operator of a conveyance would be required to have a manifest document with the following information and to provide that information to the operator of the destination site within 24 hours after arrival. This includes the premise identification number of the departure site, the premise identification number of the destination site, the number of animals or carcasses being moved, the date and time the animals or their carcasses left the departure site, and the license plate number or conveyance identification. The operator of the conveyance would also be required to keep a record of this information for 2 years. You are not required to provide this information for sheep or their carcasses transported for import, export, or within the same farm. Currently, the use of livestock manifests are required by the governments of the 4 western provinces, and this information is consistent with the humane transport information required to be kept by transporters, except for the premise identification numbers, which are new pieces to that manifest. So the sheep have departed a farm, they've been transported, and now they are arriving at your farm. Under the current regulations, you are required to record the arrival of bred sheep at your site. You would be required to record the identification number on the approved tag, the date of arrival, and the name and address of the owner or the person having care of the sheep at the departure site. Under the proposed regulations, this record-keeping requirement would be repealed, and instead, the operator of the destination site would be required to report the arrival of all sheep at your site within 7 days. Information to report would include the premise identification number of the departure site, the premise identification number of your site, the date and time the animals left the departure site, the date and time the animals arrived at your site, the identification number on the approved indicator, and the license plate number or conveyance identification. Note that the underlined points would be provided to you by the transporter. There are, however, 3 special cases with some exemptions. The first, contrary to the identification requirement, the movement reporting requirement, which is reporting the arrival of sheep at your site, would not apply to movements between sites of the same farm. There will also be a reporting exemption for movements to and from a leased pasture if there is no commingling with animals of another farm. There will be an exception for movements to and from community pastures. These requirements will be seen in more details later. The regulatory proposal is introducing a passive reading principle, which does not currently appear in the federal regulations. This principle states that if you are using reading equipment to read RFID approved indicators, and the identification number on an approved indicator is not read by the equipment on the first reading, you are not required to report the identification number, provided that the terms listed below are met. The equipment is listed on the website of a responsible administrator. You have installed the equipment in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions, and you have maintained the equipment and performed tests to ensure that it functions as intended. The passive reading principle does not apply to operators of an abattoir, operators of any site that receives sheep carcasses for the purpose of disposal, for example, renders, or for operators of any site that imports or exports sheep. Now, if sheep are ever moved to a community pasture, the definition of one is as follows: a pasture that is managed by or leased from the Government of Canada, a provincial government, or a municipality, or that is owned by, managed by, or leased from a community pasture association, grazing association, or a grazing cooperative, and where animals from more than one operator of a farm are assembled and commingled. Regulations regarding community pastures do not appear under the current federal regulations. And so under the proposed regulations, if your sheep does not already bear an approved indicator, ensure one is applied before they are moved to a community pasture. It would be the producer or owners of the sheep, their responsibility to report the departure of sheep from the farm and their return back to the farm. The operators of the community pastures would be exempt from any reporting requirements. The information to report when animals depart the farm or return from the community pasture are very similar and are as follows: the premise identification number of the farm, the premise identification number of the community pasture, the date the animals left the farm or the date the animals left the community pasture, the species of each animal transported and number of animals of each species, and if applicable, the license plate number or conveyance identification. Now regarding the loss of approved indicators. Currently, if sheep or their carcasses loses its approved indicator or tag during transport, they may continue to be transported until they are unloaded at the next destination. This provision would be maintained. It is also currently required to apply an approved tag to sheep or their carcass that are not bearing one at arrival, and to sheep or their carcass that have lost their approved indicator while at your site. These provisions would also be maintained. So if an animal has lost its tag on site, or if you have received an untagged animal at your site, you are required to apply a new approved tag. And currently, you are also required to record the application of this new approved tag. And information that you must record includes the identification number of the new approved tag, enough information about the animal or its carcass to enable its origin to be traced, including the identification number on the approved tag that was lost, the date the animal or its carcass arrived, the name and address of the owner or the person having care of the animal or its carcass on that date, and the license plate number or conveyance identification. In the proposed regulations, the record-keeping requirement would be repealed, and in those same instances when you must apply a new approved indicator, you would instead be required to report this application within 7 days. Information required to be reported would include the identification number of the new approved indicator, if known, the identification number of the approved indicator that was lost, the premise identification number of your site, if known, the premise identification number of the departure site, and if applicable, the license plate number or conveyance identification. There is an exemption that already exists today that states you do not need to report the application of a new approved tag. You do not need to record the application of a new approved tag if the animal or its carcass has never left their farm of origin and just happened to lose its first indicator on farm. This provision would be maintained and applied to the new reporting requirement. So in regards to the death of sheep, currently you are required to record the slaughter or death of sheep at your site and its identification number on the approved tag. Remember, this is in the case of a farm, not an abattoir. In the proposed regulations, the record-keeping requirements would be repealed. And by now you must have noticed a pattern here where all recording requirements are being repealed and most are being replaced with reporting requirements. Which brings me to this next slide. In the case that you are disposing of sheep carcasses on your site, currently you are required to report the on-site disposal of sheep carcasses and the identification number on their approved tags within 30 days. If the sheep carcass does not bear an approved tag, you are required to report enough information about the carcass to enable its origin to be traced within 30 days, including the site from which the carcass was removed and the date it was removed, and the name and address of the owner or the person having care of the carcass at the departure site. In the proposed regulations, you would be required to report the on-site of sheep carcasses within 7 days. and this would include the premise identification number of your site, the date on which the carcass was disposed of, and the identification number on the approved indicator. Now, that little piece about reporting if the carcass does not bear an approved tag is no longer in the proposed regulations, as the site should have the identification number of the approved indicator from the animal's move-in event. An exemption does already exist in the case where if you dispose of sheep carcasses on their farm of origin that have not had an approved indicator applied to it, you are not required to apply an approved indicator to it or report its disposal. This provision would be maintained in the proposed regulations. Now, when exporting sheep, currently, if the animal does not already bear a tag, you are required to apply an approved tag to it before it is loaded for export. This identification provision would be maintained. Currently, there are no federal requirements to report the export of sheep. Under the proposed regulations, it would be required to report the export of sheep within 7 days. This includes the premise identification number of all the sites where the animals were loaded and the number of animals loaded at each of those sites, the dates the animals were loaded and the number of animals loaded on each of those dates, the identification number on the approved indicators, the locations to which the animals are being exported, and the license plate number or conveyance identification. Note that the location refers to the country, the state, region, or province, and the site. Now, on the other hand, when importing sheep, currently you are required to identify sheep with an approved tag either before importation or at the first site at which they are unloaded after import. Under the proposed regulations, it would be required and only allowed to identify sheep with a Canadian approved tag indicator at the first site at which they are unloaded after import. So providing an approved Canadian indicator to another person for the purpose of identifying sheep that are located in a foreign country would be prohibited. There are some exemptions regarding the identification of sheep upon import into Canada, which include for animals bearing a foreign tag deemed equivalent to a Canadian approved tag, they do not need to be re-identified. This provision would be maintained in the proposed regulations. For sheep imported for immediate slaughter, they do not need to be identified with an approved tag. This provision would also be maintained in the proposed regulations. Under the proposed regulations, there would be clarification that sheep do not need to be re-identified when re-imported into Canada after having been exported. Now, for the reporting of sheep when importing them into Canada, under the current regulations, you are already required to report the import of sheep or its carcass within 7 days. You need to report the identification on the approved tag and enough information about the animal to allow its origin to be traced. Under the proposed regulations, as the person who owns or has possession, care, or control of an imported animal, you would also have to report the import of sheep within 7 days, along with a few extra bits of information, which include the locations from which the animals or carcasses were imported. This refers to the country and the state, region, or province. You would need to report the premise identification number of your site, the date the animals or carcasses arrived at your site, the identification number on the approved indicators or equivalent foreign indicators, and the license plate number or conveyance identification. Currently, there is an exemption to this reporting requirement for sheep imported for immediate slaughter. Under the proposed regulations, this exemption would be repealed. So you would need to report the import of sheep even if they were being imported for immediate slaughter. Now, there are some notable prohibitions that I will go through with you. The first 7 are not new. So first, it is prohibited to remove or cause the removal of sheep or its carcass from a site unless it bears an approved indicator, with the exceptions listed in the identification of sheep section that were for sheep being seized based on welfare issues, having to be urgently evacuated, or having a morphology that does not allow for the application of any of the indicators approved for its species. It is prohibited to apply an approved indicator to sheep or the carcass of sheep that are not at the site for which the indicator was assigned. It is prohibited to apply an indicator approved for a species to an animal or the carcass of an animal of a different species. It is prohibited to transfer an approved indicator from an animal or its carcass to another animal or its carcass, or reuse an approved indicator. It is prohibited to apply, make, sell, or provide a means of identifying animals or animal carcasses that is likely to be mistaken for an approved indicator. It is prohibited to remove an approved or revoked indicator from sheep or its carcass, except at the time and place of disposal of the carcass. This prohibition comes with special conditions. The proposed amendments would introduce options for stakeholders to remove approved indicators applied to an animal if the indicator is damaged, not functioning, applied to the wrong species, or causing harm to the animal. The stakeholder would be required to provide evidence to a CFIA inspector who would then authorize the removal of the tag. In cases involving animal welfare concerns, the evidence may be presented up to 7 days after the removal. In all instances, a new approved indicator would be required to be applied to the animal. It is also prohibited to alter an approved indicator in any manner. And this last one is new. It is prohibited to give, sell, or distribute approved indicators assigned for your site. This last prohibition is important to note that it is new because we are aware this is a common practice. Distributing approved indicators assigned for your site reduces the data quality in the traceability system and may implicate your farm in a disease response investigation. Now that we have gone over the proposed regulations, we will quickly go over our anticipated timeline and then review how to comment. But before that, I'll remind you again, you can continue asking questions using the Q&A function, and we will try to answer them at the end of the presentation or throughout. You are also free to email us with any questions or clarifications you may have on the details presented today. So we released the proposed regulatory changes on March 18th. There will be a public comment period for 90 days, which brings us to June 16th. After that, we will review the comments, make any necessary changes, consult with industry, and are anticipating reaching the final publication of the proposed regulations sometime in late 2024. There will be a 1-year delayed coming into force for regulated parties to become familiar with the new requirements, which brings us to the official coming into force date for almost all regulated parties in 2025. There will be a 2-year delayed coming into force for owners of ruminants kept primarily for research purposes, entertainment purposes, or as pets, which brings us to 2026 for that specific group. Now, regarding sharing your thoughts. First, please review the consultation webpage for important information and links to support this consultation, including the full text of the proposed regulations, the regulatory impact analysis statement, the documents to be incorporated by reference, which are the approved and revoked animal indicators pages, sector-specific guidance documents in web and PDF formats, and sector-specific webinars that you may sign up for. Then, use the Canada Gazette online commenting feature to submit comments on the proposed regulations directly on the Canada Gazette webpage. If comments are sent to us by email, you will be asked to resubmit them through this online feature. The only exception would be comments that are mailed into our office or attachments like letters. The system does not currently accept attachments, so those can be sent directly to us via email. At the end of the comment period, all comments submitted through this feature will be made publicly available. So using the online commenting feature is pretty straightforward. First, you will comment on one or more sections of the regulatory impact analysis statement or in the general comment box under the regulatory text. Please make sure you comment effectively. This means comment on the relevant sections you're concerned with, provide a rationale for your comments, and do not submit any comments that are derogatory, disrespectful, or threatening. Then identify yourself and submit your comment. Some details about comment submission: they are reviewed and moderated before being posted online. They will appear online in the language of the submitter, so they will not be translated. There is a section to submit personal or confidential business information, which will not be published. Comments can be submitted anonymously as an individual or as an organization. And if there's a need to submit files, they can be sent directly to us via email. As of right now, supporting documentation like attachments will not be posted online at the end of the consultation period due to accessibility reasons. So here's an example of where you would comment. These boxes can be found at various spots throughout on the Canada Gazette webpage. They limit your comments to about 20,000 characters, which translates to about 8 pages of text from a Word document. If you need to submit a comment longer than that, you can use multiple different comment boxes and just note that your comments are connected. Here's an example of where you would put personal or confidential business information. This will not be published even if you submit as an organization or as an individual. And here's an example of where you would enter your contact information and select how you want to submit the comments. If you have any questions when using this commenting feature, please email us. And here's our email. This brings the presentation to an end. Thank you again for attending. There is also a lot of information on the CFIA website regarding the regulatory proposal. If you think up of a new question after this call, we invite you to visit the consultation webpage, as there is guidance available in several formats, as well as future webinars on different topics that will be held. At the bottom of that webpage is our Livestock Traceability Program email, also shown here, and this can be used for any needed questions or clarifications. Keep in mind, though, actual comments on the regulatory proposal need to be entered via the commenting feature on the Canada Gazette webpage with the actual regulations. Links to these are on the main consultation page. Oops. So thanks for listening, and we'll get right into the questions if we have any.
Hi, everyone. So this is Heather Brown speaking. We've received quite a few questions. We're trying to answer some of them in the chat, and then some of them we're going to try and answer verbally because it might be easier. One of the questions we received was, how will enforcement be addressed? So this is sort of a broad question, so I'll try and answer it to the best of what I think you mean. So in general, we already have a traceability program in place, right? And we have inspection and inspectors going out and verifying compliance. And generally they do that at sort of the most high-risk locations. So we don't typically go on farms, though we can to assess compliance. We're more likely to go at abattoirs, auction marts, assembly yards, and places where we have often multiple species of animals and lots of animals coming in from different sites. And there we can look for compliance. We can trace back to the farm and see if there's been compliance at the farm level. And we do this sort of at a risk-based frequency, going to, certain places more often than others. And what we have in terms of enforcement is sort of a graduated level of enforcement. And you can find that on our website, where we start. Often when regulations first come in, we start from an education perspective, and then we go up from everything from letter of non-compliance, and then after that, we go towards what's called administrative monetary penalties that can be issued as well. But we do that in a graduated aspect, always looking at the regulated party from the level of, harm, history, and intent. So we never start with the most serious measure first. So when the new regulations come in place, obviously we will be revising our enforcement sort of schedule, and where our inspectors will be looking and what they will be looking for, because there will be now new regulations to assess compliance for. So I hope that helps. Sort of a broad way to speak about it, but if you have a more specific question, please feel free to throw it back in the chat. And then I think now we'll go to my colleague for another question.
Yes, hi, it's Marie-André Fredette. I'm working in Heather's team with Corey. So just to make sure, is that the question on how abattoirs will report animal ID for removing of animals imported for immediate slaughter, Heather? Okay, so that's the question I'm going to answer. So under the proposed regulations, there would still be no, if you remember from the slide, there will still be no requirement for sheep being imported for immediate slaughter to be identified prior to being imported. But there would still be, but there will now be, I should say, so the new addition is that the abattoir, which is usually importer, will be required to then report that importation. And so what they will be required to report is the information that was listed, that I can't remember by heart, all of it. And part of that information that is required when an animal is imported to be reported is the identification number on the approved indicator that's applied to the animal at their first destination, which won't apply to abattoirs, but also the number on an indicator that would be considered as equivalent. So in the situation where those sheep imported for immediate slaughter would not be bearing any indicators, then the reporting would be done without that information, but everything else would be expected to be reported. But obviously, if they were to bear a tag that is recognized as equivalent, that would trigger the requirement to report that equivalent tag number. Hopefully that answers the question.
Great, so we'll end the session then. If we didn't get to your question, or if you have any more, please email us and we will get back to you really quickly. As I said before, we have a lot of information on our webpage with the legal text and the guidance and more webinars that you can sign up for if interested. So that brings the presentation to an end. Thank you for listening and have a great day.